Bouncer denies entry to Overweight man, unaware he is undercover bar owner. Tony Romano rolled his massive shoulders, feeling the pleasant stretch of muscle beneath his tailored black suit. Another Friday night at the Inferno meant another evening of power, of being the gatekeeper to Dallas's most exclusive nightclub. The neon red sign above the entrance cast an otherworldly glow across the growing line of hopefuls, all desperate for his approval. "ID," Tony commanded, his voice a bass rumble that caused the young couple at the front of the line to flinch. The blonde woman fumbled with her clutch while her companion produced his driver's license with practiced ease. Tony scrutinized both IDs, though he'd already made his decision. The pair were attractive, well-dressed, and carried themselves with the confident air of those who rarely heard the word no. Tony unhooked the velvet rope. "Enjoy your evening," he said with the barest hint of a smile. "Thank you," the woman replied, flashing perfect teeth as they slipped past. The next groups followed a similar pattern. Tony's assessment was never about age. The Inferno had an aesthetic, as Lexi, the bar manager, liked to say. Young, fit, beautiful people brought in more beautiful people and big spenders. It was simple business logic. 3 hours into his shift, Tony had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. The music from inside pulsed through the walls, vibrating beneath his feet as he curated the crowd with practiced precision. The line had thinned somewhat, allowing him to take a moment to adjust his earpiece. That's when he noticed the man approaching. He was heavy-set, not just a few extra pounds but genuinely obese, dressed in a button-up shirt that strained against his stomach and jeans that had seen better days. His face was round and flushed from the walk, thinning hair combed carefully over a balding spot. Tony placed him in his late 40s, though the extra weight made it harder to tell. The man approached with confidence that didn't match his appearance. Tony felt an immediate disconnect, the kind that triggered his bouncer instincts. "Evening," the man said, offering a surprisingly firm handshake. "Rick Saunders. I was hoping to grab a drink inside." Tony didn't reciprocate the handshake. Instead, he blocked the entrance with his considerable frame, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't bother asking for ID. What was the point? "Sorry, sir. The Inferno has a certain aesthetic we maintain." Tony kept his voice professional, but allowed just enough condescension to make his meaning clear. "Perhaps O'Malley's down the street would be more your speed. They take everyone." Rick Saunders didn't argue or rage as many rejected patrons did. He simply stood there for a moment, studying Tony's face with a penetrating gaze that made the bouncer inexplicably uncomfortable. "A certain aesthetic," Rick repeated, nodding slowly. "I see." There was something in those eyes, not anger or embarrassment, but a calm assessment that made Tony feel like he was the one being evaluated. It prickled at his professional armor. "It's club policy," Tony added unnecessarily. "Of course it is." Rick smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Have a good night, Tony." Tony frowned. "How do you know my name?" Rick gestured toward Tony's chest. "Your name tag." Tony glanced down, momentarily flustered. Of course, the small silver tag pinned to his lapel. But something about the interaction still felt off. "Right. Well, good evening, sir." Rick turned and walked away, his gait steady and dignified despite the rejection. Tony watched him go with an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. Most people he turned away either exploded with entitlement or slunk off in shame. This calm acceptance was unusual. "Who was that guy?" Marcus, the second bouncer, had returned from his break. Tony shrugged. "Nobody. Just another reject." But as the night wore on, Tony found himself replaying the interaction. The man hadn't begged or offered a bribe. He hadn't name-dropped or claimed to know someone important. He'd simply accepted Tony's judgment and walked away. At 2 a.m., as the last patron staggered out into waiting Ubers, Tony helped the staff with closing procedures. Lexi approached him as he was checking the bathrooms for stragglers. "Busy night," she commented, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. "Any troublemakers?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Tony replied, his mind inexplicably flashing to Rick Saunders. Lexi leaned against the wall. You know, Tomas is thinking about opening a second location. Rumors say it'll be twice as exclusive as this place. Tomas Garcia was the general manager, the man who had hired Tony 3 years ago. Tony had never met the actual owner. Apparently, he was some wealthy investor who remained hands-off. Sounds promising, Tony said, imagining a promotion in his future. With his track record of maintaining the Inferno's standards, he could easily see himself overseeing security at both locations. Just keep doing what you're doing, Lexi said with a wink. Tomas notices who helps maintain the club's image. Tony nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. This was why he enforced the door policy so strictly. The Inferno wasn't for everyone, it wasn't supposed to be. Exclusivity created value. If they let in people like Rick Saunders, the whole carefully crafted image would collapse. As Tony left the club that night, the cool night air relief after hours in the humid heat of packed bodies, he pushed away the nagging discomfort from his encounter with Rick. He had nothing to feel guilty about. The man simply didn't fit the Inferno's clientele. It wasn't personal, it was business. Still, as Tony drove home to his empty apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about Rick Saunders was different. Those eyes had seen through him somehow, judging him in return. Ridiculous, Tony muttered to himself as he unlocked his door. He was overthinking a routine rejection. Tomorrow would be another night, another line of people desperate for his approval, and Rick Saunders would be forgotten. But as Tony fell into an uneasy sleep, Rick's words echoed in his mind. A certain aesthetic. I see. What exactly had he seen? The following evening arrived with thunderclouds brewing on the horizon, matching Tony's unsettled mood. He'd slept poorly, dreams filled with faceless people waiting in endless lines. As he walked toward the Inferno's entrance, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Gonna be a slow night, Marcus commented, eyeing the darkening sky. Tony shrugged. Rain or shine, they still come. People would wade through floods to get in here. The statement wasn't entirely untrue. Despite the weather, a modest line had already formed by opening time. Tony fell into his routine, assessing each hopeful patron with practiced efficiency. Yet something felt different tonight. Each rejection left a bitter aftertaste, like medicine lingering on his tongue. 3 hours into his shift, the club was at capacity despite the storm. Tony had just turned away a group of college students, too loud, too casually dressed, when Lexi appeared at his side, her face tight with tension. Tony, she said, voice low enough that Marcus couldn't hear. I need you inside. Now. What's going on? Tony asked, noticing her pallor. Tomas just called an emergency meeting in the VIP section. He says it's urgent and specifically requested you. Tony frowned. Emergency meetings during peak hours weren't standard practice. Who's covering the door? Marcus can handle it for a bit. Come on. Lexi led him through the packed dance floor, the bass vibrating through the soles of his shoes. They navigated around gyrating bodies and past the main bar, where bartenders were frantically mixing drinks. As they approached the roped-off VIP section, Tony spotted Tomas's slick black hair. The general manager was speaking intently to someone seated in the circular booth, their view blocked by Tomas's lean frame. There you are, Tomas said, turning as they approached. His usual confident smile looked strained. Tony, come here. There's someone you need to meet. As Tomas stepped aside, Tony's blood turned to ice. Sitting comfortably in the plush booth was Rick Saunders. Gone were the ill-fitting clothes from last night, replaced by a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow made him look commanding rather than out of place. He sat with quiet authority, one hand resting on an expensive-looking walking stick with a silver handle. Hello again, Tony, Rick said, his voice carrying easily despite the thumping music. Please join us. Tony stood frozen, his mind frantically connecting dots. Around Rick sat 3 other suits, executive types with serious expressions. One woman was taking notes on a tablet. Tony, Tomas hissed. This is Mr. Richard Saunders, The owner of the Inferno. The words hit Tony like a physical blow. The owner? The mysterious investor who never showed his face was the same man he'd so dismissively turned away? I believe we've already met, Rick said pleasantly, though his eyes held the same unsettling assessment Tony had noticed the previous night. Though our first introduction was rather abbreviated. Tony felt sweat beading on his forehead. Mr. Saunders, I didn't realize. Of course you didn't, Rick interrupted smoothly. That was the point. I've owned this club for 5 years but haven't personally visited in 2. I decided it was time to see how things were being run. He gestured to the suited individuals. My executive team suggested I simply announce myself, but I thought an undercover approach might be more illuminating. The woman with the tablet gave Tony a look that could freeze hell. Tomas cleared his throat. Mr. Romano has been with us for 3 years, sir. He's one of our most reliable security staff. Is he? Rick took a sip from his whiskey glass. Tell me, Tony, why exactly do you think I don't belong in my own club? The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Tony opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Sir, it wasn't personal. We have protocols, standards for the club's image. Yes, the aesthetic you mentioned. Rick's voice remained calm, almost conversational. I'm curious about these standards. Were they written down somewhere? Did Tomas provide you with specific criteria for who should be admitted? Tomas stiffened beside Tony, suddenly finding the ice in his drink fascinating. Not explicitly, no, Tony admitted. But it's understood that we maintain a certain clientele. Young, attractive people who fit the club's upscale image. And I didn't fit that image. It wasn't a question. With all due respect, sir, Tony said, desperately trying to salvage the situation. You presented yourself differently last night. So it's about clothing? If I'd worn the suit, would you have let me in? Tony hesitated, knowing any answer would damn him. Rick smiled thinly. I thought not. He turned to Tomas. It seems the door policy has evolved beyond what we discussed when I hired you. Tomas paled. Mr. Saunders, I assure you. We'll discuss management decisions later, Rick said firmly before returning his attention to Tony. You know, the most interesting part of last night wasn't being rejected. It was watching who you did let in after me. The pretty young things, yes, but also the belligerent drunk who nearly started a fight at the bar. I stayed to watch. Apparently, his father plays golf with someone important. Rick's eyes narrowed. Tell me, Tony, do you genuinely believe that's good for business? Tony stared at the floor, shame burning through him. No, sir. No, it isn't, Rick agreed. Do you know what made the Inferno successful? Not exclusivity based on appearance, but creating a space where people feel special, where service is impeccable and everyone is treated with respect. The executives around the table nodded in unison. I didn't build this place so people like you could play God at the door, Rick continued, his voice hardening for the first time. I built it because I love nightlife and wanted to create something better than what existed. Tony braced himself for the inevitable. I understand if you want my resignation. To his surprise, Rick chuckled. Resignation? Oh no, Tony. That would be too easy. He leaned forward, eyes alight with something that made Tony's stomach clench. I have something much more valuable in mind for you. More valuable? Tony echoed, confusion momentarily overriding his fear. The VIP booth had grown unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the pulsing chaos of the club around them. The executive team watched with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled satisfaction at Tony's discomfort. Rick gestured to the empty space beside him. Sit down, Tony. You look like you're about to pass out. Tony hesitated before sliding into the booth, maintaining as much distance from Rick as the limited space allowed. The leather seat felt slippery beneath his sweaty palms. Let me tell you something about business, Rick said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Firing someone is easy. It's reactive. Temporary. But changing someone's perspective? He tapped his temple with his index finger. That has lasting impact. Tomas shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Saunders, perhaps we should discuss this in private. Tomas. Rick interrupted without looking away from Tony. Would you mind giving us a moment? You too, Lexi. I'd like to speak with Tony alone. The bar manager and general manager exchanged glances before nodding respectfully. They retreated toward the bar, leaving Tony alone with Rick and his executive team. You've worked here 3 years, Rick continued once they'd gone. Long enough to become the living embodiment of this club's unwritten rules. You're a symptom of a culture I never intended to create. Sir, I was just doing what I thought was expected. No interruptions, said the woman with the tablet sharply. Rick raised a hand. It's all right, Vanessa. Let him speak. Tony swallowed hard. I believed I was upholding the club's standards. Maintaining its reputation. Based on what criteria, exactly? Rick asked. Youth? Beauty? The right clothes? Or just your personal biases? The question hung between them, impossible to deflect. I suppose my judgment, Tony admitted. What I thought would be good for business. And you thought rejecting people who look like me would be good for business. Rick placed his glass down with deliberate care. Do you know what my net worth is, Tony? Tony shook his head. Enough that I could buy and sell this club 10 times over without blinking. That heavy-set man you turned away last night? He could have ordered bottle service for the entire VIP section and tipped your staff enough to change their lives. The executives nodded in agreement, their expressions making it clear that Rick wasn't exaggerating. But it's not about the money, Rick continued. It's about dignity. About creating spaces where people feel welcome, not judged by superficial standards. I understand, Tony said quietly, though he wasn't sure he did. Rick studied him for a long moment. No, I don't think you do. Not yet. He leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. How old are you, Tony? 34. And before working here? Your background? Tony shifted uncomfortably. Professional boxing. Middleweight division. Made it to regional championships before blowing out my shoulder. Something flickered across Rick's face. Recognition, perhaps even understanding. So you've spent your life in environments where physical appearance and athleticism determine worth. It wasn't a question, but Tony nodded anyway. Rick drummed his fingers on the table, coming to a decision. I have a proposition for you, Tony. A challenge, if you will. The executives exchanged knowing glances, making Tony suspect this challenge had been discussed before this meeting. What kind of challenge? Tony asked warily. 1 week, Rick said, holding up a single finger. Spend 1 week experiencing life from my perspective. Tony frowned, confusion evident. I don't understand. Vanessa, Rick said, turning to the woman with the tablet. Show him. She tapped on her screen, then turned it toward Tony. On the display was an image of what appeared to be a high-quality prosthetic bodysuit, complete with realistic silicone features and substantial padding. A fat suit? Tony blurted, immediately regretting his bluntness. We prefer body empathy simulator, one of the executives said with a tight smile. It's used in medical training and sensitivity programs. Rick leaned forward. You'll wear it for 1 week. Every day, all day. You'll go about your normal life, grocery shopping, dining out, socializing. You'll visit places where you think you'd be welcome. His eyes narrowed slightly. Including other nightclubs. Tony stared at Rick in disbelief. You can't be serious. I'm entirely serious. Rick's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet. Consider it an immersive education. You've spent your career judging others based on their appearance. Now you'll experience what it's like to be on the receiving end. Tony felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. This is ridiculous. It's humiliating. Is it? Rick asked quietly. More humiliating than being turned away from a public establishment because of how you look? The question landed like a slap, and Tony fell silent. Your choice is simple, Rick continued. Take the challenge, or clean out your locker tonight. If you complete the week, you'll have a place at the Inferno, though perhaps in a different capacity. Tony glanced toward the bar, where Tomas and Lexi were pretending not to watch. 3 years of building connections, of establishing himself. Walking away meant starting over somewhere else, likely with a reputation that would follow him. "And if I refuse?" Tony asked, already knowing the answer. "Then you're not the person I thought you might be," Rick said simply. "And we have nothing more to discuss." The music seemed to fade as Tony weighed his options. Pride screamed at him to walk out, to tell Rick Saunders where he could shove his challenge. But survival, and perhaps something deeper he couldn't yet name, whispered that he should stay. "When would this experiment start?" Tony asked finally. Rick's expression remained neutral, but something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning. Vanessa will meet you at a medical facility where they'll fit you properly. The suit is anatomically correct and designed for extended wear." Tony took a deep breath. "And after the week? We'll talk again. Just you and me." Tony looked at the executives, at the tablet still displaying the bulky silicone suit, at Rick's unwavering gaze. This wasn't just about keeping his job. This was something more, a test of character he wasn't entirely sure he could pass. "1 week," Tony said finally, his voice hollow. "I'll do it." Rick extended his hand across the table. "I'll see you in 7 days, Tony. I hope you learned something valuable along the way." As they shook hands, Tony couldn't help feeling he'd just agreed to his own execution. The body empathy simulator was worse than Tony had imagined. Standing in the sterile fitting room of some high-end medical facility, he stared at his transformed reflection with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The suit added nearly 100 pounds to his frame, distributed realistically around his midsection, thighs, and face. His chiseled jawline had disappeared, replaced by a double chin that sagged below a now round face. Specially designed compression padding even altered his posture, forcing him to stand differently to accommodate the extra weight. "The material is breathable," explained the technician, a petite woman named Dr. Chen who had overseen the fitting process. "Though you'll still feel warmer than usual. That's part of the experience." "It feels heavy," Tony said, the words sounding foreign in his ears. Even his voice seemed different, slightly muffled by the prosthetic jowls. "That's the point," she replied matter-of-factly. "You're not just looking different, you're experiencing the physical reality of carrying extra weight." "And I have to wear this for an entire week?" Dr. Chen nodded. "Mr. Saunders was very specific about the parameters. You'll sleep without it, but otherwise it stays on." She handed him a small bottle. "This is adhesive remover for the facial attachments. You'll need it for cleaning purposes." Tony took the bottle, still unable to look away from his reflection. The man in the mirror was a stranger, soft where he'd always been hard, imposing in size rather than musculature. "Your clothes won't fit properly anymore," Dr. Chen continued, gesturing to a large duffel bag. "Mr. Saunders has provided a new wardrobe for the week." Of course he had. Tony fought down a surge of resentment as he left the facility, carrying the duffel bag with his normal clothes inside. The sidewalk felt different beneath his feet, harder, less forgiving. Every step required more effort, more conscious thought. By the time he reached his car, he was already sweating. Getting behind the wheel proved to be the first real challenge. His new bulk pressed against the steering wheel, forcing him to adjust the seat for the first time since buying the car. Something so simple, yet it sent a wave of frustration through him. 1 week, he muttered, starting the engine. Just 7 days. He decided to start with something straightforward, grocery shopping. A mundane task he'd performed 1,000 times before. Nothing to it. The moment Tony entered the upscale market he frequented, he sensed a difference. Not in the store, but in how people reacted to him. A woman pulled her shopping cart slightly closer as he passed. The produce clerk who usually greeted him with a friendly nod looked through him instead of at him. "Excuse me," Tony said, approaching the deli counter where he ordered his weekly protein. "Could I get a pound of the roasted turkey breast?" The clerk glanced up, his eyes performing the quick assessment Tony himself had done countless times at the Inferno's door. Sure thing, buddy. Anything else? The subtlety wasn't lost on Tony. The slight change in tone, the barely perceptible shift from respectful to condescending. Buddy. Not sir. It was nothing he could definitively call discrimination, yet the difference was palpable. As he waited for his order, Tony noticed a fit, attractive woman in yoga attire eyeing the same premium turkey. The clerk finished Tony's order, then immediately brightened as he turned to her. Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you today? The contrast was so stark it was almost comical. Almost. Tony left the store with his groceries, feeling eyes tracking his movement, not with admiration or respect, but with judgment. He'd felt invisible and hyper-visible simultaneously, an unsettling contradiction. The afternoon only grew more challenging. At the high-end clothing store where he often bought his suits, a salesperson approached then veered away when getting a closer look at Tony, suddenly finding inventory to organize. After 10 minutes of browsing without assistance, Tony approached the man directly. I'm looking for a dress shirt, he said, forcing confidence into his voice. The salesperson barely concealed his surprise. Our extended sizes are in the back corner, he said, gesturing vaguely before turning to greet a slimmer customer who'd just walked in. Extended sizes. Corner. Away from the main floor. The symbolism wasn't subtle. By evening, Tony was physically and emotionally exhausted. His shoulders ached from the weight of the suit, his skin irritated where the prosthetics met his natural body. But more than the physical discomfort was the mental burden, the constant awareness of being seen differently, treated differently. He decided to test the theory more directly. There was another club across town, Elysium, known for its similarly exclusive atmosphere. Tony had occasionally collaborated with their head of security during city-wide events. He arrived at Elysium close to midnight dressed in the best outfit from the duffel bag, a dark button-up shirt and slacks that fit his new body comfortably. The line wasn't long, perhaps 20 people. Tony got in place, ignoring the curious glances from those ahead of him. When he finally reached the front, he recognized the bouncer, Damon, a former MMA fighter with whom he'd shared protein shake recipes just months ago. ID, Damon said flatly, not recognizing Tony beneath the prosthetics. Tony handed over his driver's license, watching as Damon compared the photo to the face before him. The bouncer's expression shifted from confusion to vague amusement. This doesn't look like you, he said, his tone suggesting he'd caught Tony in a lie rather than failing to see past the disguise. It's me, Tony insisted. Just gained some weight recently. Damon handed back the ID with a smirk. Listen, man, we're at capacity right now. Maybe try again another night. He unhooked the velvet rope for the attractive couple behind Tony. You two can go right in. The rejection stung with a surprising intensity. Tony opened his mouth to reveal his identity, to pull rank as a fellow security professional, then stopped. This was the point, wasn't it? To experience exactly this. Sure, Tony said instead, the word bitter on his tongue. I understand. The club has a certain aesthetic. Damon's eyes widened slightly at the familiar phrase before Tony turned and walked away, the weight of more than just the suit bearing down on him. In the silence of his car, Tony sat motionless, replaying the interaction. His own words thrown back at him had landed with unexpected force. For the first time, he truly heard how they sounded from the other side. 3 days later, the lessons had only deepened. Ignored by waitstaff at his favorite restaurant. Receiving unsolicited diet advice from a stranger at the gym. A woman clutching her purse tighter when he entered an elevator. None of it was dramatic. None of it made for sensational stories. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Small indignities that accumulated with crushing weight, far heavier than the suit itself. By the 6th day, Tony had developed a routine. Wake up, shower, carefully apply the suit according to Dr. Chen's instructions, and venture into a world. His movements had slowed, not just from the physical burden but from a new hesitancy. Today, he'd take the final test Rick had implied, returning to the Inferno. Not as an employee, but as a patron attempting entry. Tony dressed in the nicest outfit from the provided wardrobe, a dark blue button-up and black slacks that skimmed his new proportions without emphasizing them. He trimmed the beard he'd grown to better blend with the facial prosthetics and applied cologne. As he drove to the club, memories from his boxing days surfaced unexpectedly. His coach screaming about being 2 pounds overweight before a qualification match. The brutal cutting sessions in the sauna, wrapped in plastic like meat. Teammates who disappeared after failing weigh-ins, their careers evaporating for the sin of human biology. Discipline is everything, Coach Maddox had drilled into them. Your body is a machine. Let it get soft, and you're worthless. Tony had absorbed those lessons completely, carrying them long after his boxing career ended. His meticulous gym schedule, protein-packed meal prep, and yes, his judgments of others who didn't maintain similar standards, all stemmed from those formative years. The Inferno's familiar neon sign came into view, casting its crimson glow across the parking lot. Tony pulled in, his heart hammering with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first professional fight. This was ridiculous. He knew everyone inside. They were his colleagues, some even friends. But they wouldn't recognize him. To them, he would be exactly what he'd been to Rick Saunders, just another heavy-set man trying to enter a space not designed for him. Marcus was working the door tonight, with a younger bouncer Tony didn't recognize as backup. The line was modest, a typical Wednesday crowd. Tony joined it, keeping his head down as he inched forward. When he finally reached the front, he forced himself to look Marcus in the eye. "ID?" Marcus asked, his tone professionally neutral. Tony handed over his driver's license. As with Damon at Elysium, Marcus studied it, then looked at Tony with suspicion. "Recent photo?" he asked. "Not really," Tony admitted. Marcus handed back the ID, his expression shifting to one Tony recognized immediately. He'd worn it himself countless times. The rejection face. Polite but immovable. "Sorry, man. We're at capacity tonight." Tony glanced past him at the clearly half-empty entrance. "Doesn't look full to me." "Private event," Marcus replied smoothly. "Members only." The lie was so familiar it was almost comforting. Tony had used the same excuse himself, the verbal equivalent of a sleight of hand, rejection disguised as circumstance rather than judgment. "I know the owner," Tony said, the irony of the statement not lost on him. "Rick Saunders." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty. "Everyone knows the owner," he replied, though with less conviction. "Call Lexi," Tony suggested. "Tell her I'm here for my meeting with Rick." Marcus hesitated, then nodded to the younger bouncer to watch the line. He stepped away, speaking quietly into his radio. Tony waited, acutely aware of the impatient sighs from those behind him. A minute later, Marcus returned, his demeanor completely transformed. "My apologies, sir. Ms. Lexi will escort you in personally." When Lexi emerged, her eyes widened momentarily before she composed herself. "Mr. Saunders is expecting you," she said professionally, leading Tony inside. The club's interior felt different from this perspective, more intimidating, less welcoming. Patrons gave him a wider berth as he followed Lexi to the back office, some not bothering to hide their surprise at his presence. Rick was waiting in the small conference room, dressed casually in a navy polo that somehow looked tailored despite his size. He stood as Tony entered, offering his hand. "You made it," he said simply. Tony nodded, exhaustion suddenly crashing over him. "I did." "Sit." Rick gestured to a chair. "You look like you've been through a war." "Feels like it," Tony admitted, lowering himself carefully. The prosthetics had chafed his skin raw in places, and his back ached constantly from compensating for the altered center of gravity. "So," Rick said after a moment of silence, "what did you learn?" Tony stared at his hands, now pudgy and unfamiliar. "Everything. Nothing." He looked up at Rick. "Both somehow." Rick waited, patient. "I used to think weight was just about discipline," Tony said finally. "About choices. Black and white. And now?" Tony struggled to articulate the profound shift in his worldview. It's so much more complicated than that. The world, it changes how it treats you. Completely. And for what? The same person is inside. Yes, Rick said quietly. The same person. I don't understand why you didn't fire me, Tony admitted. After what I did to you at the door. Rick leaned back in his chair. Because I recognized something in you that night. Something familiar. What was that? Self-hatred, Rick said simply. Not directed at me, but at what I represented. A fear. Tony flinched at the accuracy. I was a boxer, he said, the confession suddenly spilling out. Middleweight. My entire identity was built around making weight, staying lean. My coach. He swallowed hard. He ruined us. Mentally. Physically. I saw teammates develop eating disorders, take dangerous supplements. One died of heart failure at 26 from yo-yo dieting. Rick nodded. And you internalized the message. Being overweight became the ultimate failure. It was drilled into us daily. Tony confirmed. Miss weight, lose everything. Your spot, your sponsorships, your worth. I understand more than you might think, Rick said. I was an athlete too once. College football. Offensive lineman. Tony looked up in surprise. Rick smiled sadly. 3 knee surgeries by 22. After the last one, doctors said another season would cripple me permanently. I gained weight when I couldn't train the same way, lost my scholarship, and suddenly found myself in a world that saw me differently. What did you do? Tony asked. Spiraled at first, Rick admitted. Depression, isolation. Then one night I tried to go to a club with friends and the bouncer. He gestured at Tony. Well, you know that part of the story. Tony nodded, shame washing over him again. That night changed me. Rick continued. Not because of the rejection, but because I finally understood my worth wasn't determined by my appearance or athletic ability. It was far deeper than that. He leaned forward. I built my first club with money from a tech startup I founded. Created the place I'd been turned away from, but with a different philosophy. No judgment. No superficial standards. Just excellent service and respect for everyone who walks through the door. And I ruined that, Tony said quietly. Rick shook his head. No. The culture evolved over time. Tomas, Lexi, you, everyone began enforcing unwritten rules that corrupted the original vision. That's on me for not being more present. So what now? Tony asked, dreading the answer. Do you want my resignation? Rick studied him thoughtfully. That depends entirely on you, Tony. You've seen both sides now. You've walked in shoes very different from your own. So I'll ask you directly, do you want to change? The question hung between them, heavier than any weight Tony had carried all week. 3 months after Tony's week in the body empathy simulator, the Inferno was nearly unrecognizable, not in its physical appearance, but in its atmosphere. Gone was the palpable tension at the entrance, the silent judgments, the quiet rejections based on arbitrary standards. In their place was something Tony had never expected to create, genuine welcome. ID please, Tony said to the nervous young man at the front of the line. He checked it quickly, handed it back with a smile. First time at the Inferno? The man nodded, fidgeting with his collar. He was heavy-set, much like Rick, dressed in clothes that tried hard to minimize his size. You're going to love it, Tony said, unhooking the velvet rope. The DJ tonight is incredible. Head to the bar and tell Marco it's your first visit, first drinks on the house. The man's surprise was evident. Really? Thanks, man. Tony watched him enter, shoulders already relaxing as he realized he wasn't going to be subjected to the scrutiny he'd clearly been expecting. Another small victory in what had become Tony's personal mission. That's 128, came a voice behind him. Lexi stood there with her tablet, making a note. 128 what? Tony asked, though he already knew. People who look genuinely shocked that you let them in, she replied with a grin. We should start a formal tally. Tony laughed, but the number meant something to him. Each surprised face represented years of conditioned expectations. People who had learned through experience that places like the Inferno weren't for them. After his conversation with Rick that final night of the challenge, Tony had made his choice. Not just to keep his job, but to transform it. Rick had created a new position for him, Director of Guest Experience. The title came with more responsibility, better pay, and a fundamental shift in purpose. Rather than keeping people out, Tony's job was ensuring everyone who entered had an exceptional experience. The new door policy was simple: valid ID, appropriate club attire, clearly defined and posted online, and respectful behavior. Nothing about appearance, weight, or perceived social status. No more arbitrary rejections. Not everyone had embraced the change. 2 bouncers quit rather than adapt. Tomas had been reassigned to another venue in Rick's growing hospitality group. But the results spoke for themselves. Revenue was up 15%, and their social media mentions had skyrocketed with positive reviews. "Mr. Romano?" A staff member approached. "Mr. Saunders is here. He asked to see you when you have a moment." Tony nodded. "I'll be right in." He signaled to his new assistant, Darius, to take over the door. Darius, a former professional wrestler built like a refrigerator but with the gentle demeanor of a kindergarten teacher, gave him a thumbs up. Inside, Tony found Rick at his usual table in the VIP section, now wheelchair accessible and redesigned with varied seating options to accommodate different body types. The club owner was chatting with a diverse group of guests, his genuine laughter carrying across the space. "Tony!" Rick called, waving him over. "Join us for a moment." Tony approached, greeting the table with a warm smile. Among the group was a familiar face, the young man he'd welcomed earlier. "This is my nephew Charlie," Rick said, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "First time visiting his uncle's club. Says you gave him quite the welcome." "Just doing my job," Tony replied, extending his hand to Charlie. "Hope you're enjoying yourself." "Totally different from what my friends said it would be like," Charlie admitted. "They told me I'd never get past the door." Rick and Tony exchanged a knowing glance. "Old reputation," Rick explained. "We're working on changing that." After a few minutes of conversation, Tony excused himself to return to his duties. Rick followed, catching up to him near the bar. "Walk with me a minute," the owner asked. They moved toward the back office, away from the pulsing music. Rick closed the door behind them, muffling the club's energy to a distant throb. "Charlie reminded me of something," Rick said, settling into a chair. "I never really asked you about your final night in the suit. You came to the Inferno, met with me, but what happened afterward?" Tony leaned against the desk, memories of that night washing over him. "I went home. Took off the suit for the last time. And then I looked in the mirror for a long time." "What did you see?" Rick asked quietly. "Not what I expected," Tony admitted. "I thought I'd feel relief seeing my old body again. Instead, I felt disconnected from it somehow. Like I was looking at a stranger." He paused, gathering thoughts that had taken months to process. "My whole life, I defined myself by this." He gestured to his still athletic frame. "But that week showed me how hollow that definition was. How little it actually said about who I am." Rick nodded, understanding in his eyes. "There was a moment," Tony continued, "standing there in my bathroom, when I finally understood what you meant about self-hatred. I didn't reject you at the door because of how you looked. I rejected you because you represented what I feared becoming. What I'd been taught to despise." "And now?" Rick asked. Tony smiled. "Now I'm trying to unlearn all that poison. To judge people, including myself, by something more meaningful than appearance." Rick stood, extending his hand. "That's the real victory then. Not keeping your job or implementing a new door policy, but changing what you see when you look in the mirror." "Speaking of policy changes," Tony said, accepting the handshake, "I wanted to run something by you. I've been thinking about implementing inclusivity training for all staff. Not just theoretical discussions, but something experiential, similar to what I went through." Rick's eyebrows rose. The suits? Not necessarily that extreme, Tony clarified. But something that creates genuine empathy, not just compliance with rules. I like it, Rick said, genuine approval in his voice. Draft a proposal. As they walked back into the club, Tony surveyed the dance floor. Bodies of all shapes and sizes moved to the music, the atmosphere electric with genuine enjoyment. Near the entrance, Darius was welcoming a group of women with the same respect he showed everyone. There's one more thing, Tony said, pausing at the edge of the VIP section. I never properly apologized to you. For that night at the door. Rick waved away the words. Water under the bridge. No, Tony insisted. It needs to be said. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Rick studied him for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. But remember, the goal was never to make you sorry. It was to make you see. I do see, Tony said quietly. More clearly than ever before. As Rick rejoined his nephew's table, Tony returned to the entrance, taking his position beside Darius. The line had grown, faces eager with anticipation rather than anxiety. Tony unhooked the velvet rope, gestured the next group forward, and spoke the words that had become his personal mantra. Welcome to the Inferno. We're glad you're here.